Millions of people have looked at this photograph for decades and believed they knew the story behind it. They saw a smiling bride. They saw the most famous entertainer on earth. They saw elegance. They saw celebration. They saw the beginning of what looked like a perfect life. But photographs are liars. They freeze a single heartbeat while hiding everything that happens before it and everything that follows after. Exactly 20 seconds after this photograph was taken, Elvis Presley walked away from his own wedding reception without saying a word. His smile disappeared. His heartbeat refused to slow. His bride reached for his hand and whispered something only he could hear. He never answered. Instead, he looked past the cameras, past the cheering guests, past the flowers, past the music, toward a man dressed entirely in black. The stranger held nothing more than an old silver pocket watch. To everyone else, it looked ordinary. To Elvis,
it looked like a ghost had just walked into the room. Because the last person who had ever carried that watch had disappeared years earlier. Everyone believed he was dead, including Elvis. No newspaper ever discovered why the king of rock and roll vanished during the happiest night of his life. No photographer ever captured where he went. No guest ever understood why, when he finally returned, there were tears in his eyes instead of joy. Because that wedding was never just a wedding. It was the night the past came back to collect a promise. And some promises never die. Las Vegas. The city never truly slept. Even long after midnight, its streets pulsed with light, music, and dreams bought with chips and luck. Neon signs painted the desert sky in impossible shades of crimson, sapphire, and gold. Luxury cars glided past enormous casinos, while tourists filled the sidewalks, chasing memories they hoped would last forever. But inside one of the city's most luxurious hotels, another kind of history was unfolding. The ballroom looked almost unreal. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls. Thousands of tiny lights reflected through polished marble floors until the room itself seemed to glow. White roses climbed across golden pillars. Fresh orchids rested on every table. Soft candlelight danced against silver glasses. Everything had been prepared with absolute perfection. Nothing had been left to chance. Because tonight, the king of rock and roll was getting married. Excitement filled every corner of the ballroom. Movie stars laughed together. Musicians exchanged stories. Television personalities greeted politicians. Businessmen raised expensive champagne. Everyone wanted to say they had witnessed history. Photographers crowded together near the stage. Every few seconds, another flash exploded across the room. Click, click, click. Every photograph would become priceless. Every smile would become immortal. Near the center of the ballroom stood Elvis Presley. His black tuxedo fit perfectly. His hair had been carefully styled. Every detail reflected elegance. He looked exactly like the magazines expected him to look. Confident, handsome, untouchable. America's greatest star. Standing beside him was Priscilla. She looked breathtaking. Her wedding gown shimmered beneath the crystal lights like fresh snow beneath the morning sun. A delicate veil framed her gentle smile. She wasn't looking at the cameras. She wasn't thinking about the guests. She wasn't wondering what tomorrow's newspapers would say. She was looking only at Elvis. To her, there wasn't a superstar standing beside her. There wasn't a global icon. There wasn't a legend. There was simply the man she loved. The man whose laughter had filled quiet evenings. The man whose voice became softer
whenever the world wasn't watching. The man she believed she truly knew. When their eyes met,
She smiled. Elvis smiled back. The cameras exploded again. Click, click, click. The applause became louder. "Congratulations! God bless you both! What a beautiful couple!" Voices echoed through the ballroom from every direction. Elvis waved politely. He thanked everyone. He laughed when expected. He shook hands. He posed for photographs. He looked absolutely perfect. Except Priscilla noticed something no one else could. She had spent enough nights sitting quietly beside him to recognize the smallest changes. His smile hadn't reached his eyes. There was a strange distance behind them, almost as though part of him wasn't standing inside this ballroom. It was somewhere else, somewhere years away, somewhere he had tried very hard to forget. She gently slipped her fingers between his. His hand felt colder than usual. Not freezing, just wrong. She leaned closer. "So many people came to celebrate us." Elvis nodded. "They did. You still look worried." "I'm not. You've never been able to lie to me." A small smile crossed Elvis's face. "You always notice." "I always will." For a moment, the weight inside his chest seemed lighter. He looked at her, really looked at her. Perhaps this was what peace finally felt like. Perhaps the years of endless concerts, the screaming crowds, the impossible expectations, the exhausting fame. Perhaps they had all finally led him here, to this single moment. A quiet life, a family, a future. Maybe he truly deserved happiness. Then, the master of ceremonies stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," the room slowly fell silent. "It is now time for the traditional wedding cake." Thunderous applause erupted. The orchestra began another elegant melody. Several photographers hurried closer until they nearly surrounded the couple. The enormous wedding cake stood almost as tall as Priscilla's shoulder. White icing, golden decorations, fresh roses sculpted entirely from sugar. It looked less like dessert, more like a work of art. The silver knife was placed into Elvis's hand. Priscilla wrapped her fingers gently over his. Together, they cut the first slice. Cheers erupted once again. Champagne glasses lifted into the air. Someone shouted, "One kiss!" Laughter spread across the ballroom. Another storm of camera flashes exploded. Priscilla laughed softly. She picked up a small fork, carefully cut a tiny piece of cake, then held it toward Elvis. He smiled, leaned forward, opened his mouth, and froze. Something had caught his attention. Not the cake, not the applause, not the cameras. Someone. Standing beyond the photographers, far across the ballroom, hidden beside one of the marble columns. A man, perfectly still. Black suit, black leather gloves, black tie. His face remained hidden beneath the shadows. He wasn't talking. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't even watching the celebration. He was watching Elvis. Only Elvis. The stranger slowly lifted his left hand. Dangling between his fingers was an old silver pocket watch. Elvis's heartbeat stopped. The ballroom disappeared. The applause faded. The orchestra became nothing but distant noise. His breathing grew shallow. No, that couldn't be possible. His fingers tightened around the fork. His knuckles turned white.
He knew that watch. Not because it was expensive, not because it was beautiful, because of one tiny scratch running across its cover. A scratch made years ago, on a rainy night, when another pair of trembling hands had dropped it onto cold railroad tracks. He remembered everything. The rain, the station, the train whistle, the promise, the terrified face of a young man whose life had depended on Elvis making one impossible choice, a choice he had spent years pretending never happened. The stranger quietly clicked the pocket watch shut.
The tiny metallic sound loosely reached Elvis through hundreds of voices. Click. It echoed inside his mind, exactly the same sound, exactly the same memory.
The stranger gave the smallest nod, not a greeting, not a warning. Recognition. Then he disappeared into the crowd, gone, as though he had dissolved into the music itself. "Elvis?" Priscilla whispered. He didn't answer. The guests noticed nothing. The photographers kept shouting, "Over here! Smile!" "Perfect!" someone laughed. Another toast began. Everything around him continued moving. Everything inside him had stopped. Priscilla gently squeezed his hand again. This time, she felt it. His hand was shaking, not slightly, violently. She had never felt him tremble before. Not before a concert, not before television appearances, not before meeting presidents. Never. She lowered her voice. "What happened?" Elvis continued staring toward the place where the stranger had vanished. His jaw tightened. He swallowed.
His lips barely moved. "Please." His voice was almost inaudible. "Don't ask me anything until this wedding is over." Priscilla searched his face. There was fear, real fear. But there was something even deeper. Guilt. Old guilt. The kind that survives for years. The kind that never truly sleeps. She wanted answers. She deserved them. Instead, she simply nodded. "I trust you." Those 4 words struck harder than any accusation ever could. Because at that moment, Elvis wasn't sure he deserved her trust anymore. The orchestra began another song. Guests returned to dancing. The celebration continued. Laughter filled the ballroom once again. Yet somewhere beneath the music, beneath the applause, beneath every smile captured forever on film, time had quietly begun running out. Because the man with the silver pocket watch had not come to ruin a wedding. He had come to collect a debt. And before this night was over, Elvis Presley would be forced to open a door he had spent years desperately trying to keep closed. He had buried the truth beneath fame, beneath fortune, beneath applause. But the past had finally found him, and this time, it wasn't leaving without an answer. The music never stopped. Inside the ballroom, crystal glasses continued to rise. Laughter echoed beneath the chandeliers. The orchestra played another elegant melody, while photographers chased one perfect photograph after another. To every guest, the evening remained flawless. To Elvis Presley, it felt as though the walls were slowly closing in around him. He forced another smile, another handshake, another photograph. Every movement looked natural. Every word sounded rehearsed. But inside, memories he had buried beneath years of fame were beginning to claw their way back to the surface. Priscilla watched him carefully. She had never seen him like this, not before a concert, not before a television appearance, not even during the most exhausting tours.
There was something different tonight, something that had stolen the light from his eyes. She gently reached for his arm. Elvis. He looked at her for just a moment. There was love in his eyes. There was gratitude.
But there was also fear. The kind of fear that belonged to a man who already knew his past had finally caught up with him. "I'll be back." His voice was barely louder than a whisper. "It won't take long." She searched his face.
You promise?
Elvis hesitated, only for a heartbeat. Then he nodded. "I promise." The word cut through him like a knife, because promises were exactly what had brought him here. He quietly stepped away from the celebration. No dramatic exit, no hurried footsteps, no panic. He simply disappeared into the crowd, while another toast distracted every eye in the ballroom. No one noticed, except the man in the black suit. The corridor outside the ballroom felt strangely silent. The laughter disappeared the moment the heavy doors closed behind him. Only the distant hum of the air conditioning remained. Elvis walked slowly across the polished marble floor. His footsteps echoed through the empty hallway. Every step carried another memory. Every breath became heavier. The elevator doors opened with a soft metallic sound. He stepped inside, alone. As the doors closed, he caught his own reflection in the polished steel. For a moment, he didn't recognize the man staring back. Not the confident performer, not the king of rock and roll. Just a tired man, carrying a secret far older than his fame. The elevator descended, one floor, then another. Every passing second tightened the knot in his chest. When the doors finally opened, the stranger was waiting, exactly where Elvis somehow knew he would be. Hands folded in front of him, expression unreadable. The silver pocket watch rested quietly in his palm. Tick, tick, tick. Its soft rhythm filled the silence. Neither man spoke. For several long seconds, they simply looked at one another. Finally, the stranger broke the silence. "You came." His voice was calm, almost emotionless. Elvis answered without taking another step.
"I had no choice."
"No."
The stranger shook his head slowly. "You had a choice. You've had one for years." Those words landed like stones. Elvis lowered his eyes. The stranger reached into his coat. For a brief instant, Elvis's heart raced. Instead of a weapon, the man removed an old yellow envelope. Its edges were worn. Its paper had darkened with age. It looked as though it had survived countless journeys. He held it out. Elvis didn't move. "You know what's inside." "I hoped I was wrong." "You weren't." After several painful seconds, Elvis finally accepted the envelope. His hands trembled, not because of fear, because deep inside, he already knew whose handwriting waited inside. Slowly, he opened it. There was no letter, only a single black and white photograph. Its corners were bent, rain stains covered one side. Elvis stared at it without breathing. The picture showed two young men standing beside an abandoned railroad station beneath a stormy sky. One of them was unmistakably Elvis. Years younger, before the movies, before the fame had reached every corner of the world. Beside him stood another young man, thin, nervous, holding that same silver pocket watch. His name was Daniel Carter. A name Elvis had not spoken aloud in years. His closest friend before the world discovered him. The man everyone believed had disappeared forever. On the back of the photograph, only one sentence had been written. Some promises wait patiently. Nothing else. No signature. No explanation. Just those 4 words. Elvis closed his eyes, and suddenly, the hallway disappeared. Rain hammered the roof of a tiny railroad station. Years earlier, long before sold-out arenas, long before screaming fans, long before anyone called him the King. A younger Elvis stood beneath a broken street lamp beside Daniel Carter. Both were soaked by the storm. A freight train roared somewhere beyond the darkness. Daniel's hands shook uncontrollably.
They're looking for me. I know. If they find me... Elvis grabbed his friend's shoulder. They won't. Daniel tried to smile. It didn't last. If I disappear... He removed the silver pocket watch from his pocket. My father gave me this. He placed it into Elvis's hand. If anyone ever comes carrying this watch, he paused. Don't ignore them. Elvis frowned. What are you talking about? Daniel looked toward the approaching train. There are things I can't tell you. They'd put you in danger. I don't care. I do. Silence. Rain continued falling. Steam hissed from the train. Daniel's voice became almost impossible to hear. If they ever find me... No. If they do... He forced the words out. Promise me, you'll protect her. Elvis stared at him. Who? Daniel looked away. The only family I have left. I can't ask anyone else. I swear. Elvis answered immediately. I'll protect her. Daniel looked relieved. For the first time that night, he smiled. The train whistle screamed through the darkness. Moments later, Daniel climbed aboard. The train disappeared into the storm, and Elvis never saw him again. Or at least, that was what he had believed. The memory shattered. Elvis opened his eyes. He was back in the hotel corridor. The stranger hadn't moved. You remember now, Elvis's voice cracked. Daniel. The stranger slowly nodded. He kept his promise. A long silence followed. Then came the words Elvis had feared more than anything. Now, the stranger stepped closer. It's your turn. Elvis's heartbeat thundered inside his chest. My turn? For what? The stranger looked directly into his eyes. She's alive. Every sound disappeared. Even the ticking of the pocket watch seemed to stop. Elvis couldn't breathe. For years, he had believed there was no one left to protect, no promise left to keep, no unfinished chapter waiting in the darkness. But now, everything he believed had just been destroyed. The stranger leaned closer. His voice became little more than a whisper. They've already found her. Then he placed the silver pocket watch into Elvis's trembling hand, turned around, and walked into the shadows, leaving Elvis completely alone, holding nothing except an old photograph, a forgotten promise, and the terrifying realization that somewhere, on the very night of his own wedding, someone's life now depended on him. The pocket watch felt impossibly heavy, not because of its weight, because of everything it carried. Elvis stood alone in the silent corridor, staring at the old photograph while the stranger's final words echoed through his mind. They've already found her. For several seconds, he couldn't move. The laughter from the ballroom sounded impossibly far away. It was as if two different worlds now existed inside the same hotel. One was filled with music, the other with ghosts. 1,000 questions stormed through his mind. Who had sent the stranger? Where had Daniel been all these years? Why wait until tonight? And above all, who was she? Elvis slowly turned the photograph over once more. This time, he noticed something he had missed before. Near one corner of the faded picture, barely visible beneath years of scratches, was an address. Not complete, only the name of an old neighborhood on the edge of Las Vegas. The stranger had left it there on purpose. It was enough. Without another thought, Elvis hurried toward the hotel entrance. Outside, the desert night was unusually cold. The city still glittered with life. Neon lights reflected across polished streets. Music poured from casinos. Taxi drivers shouted for passengers. No one recognized the groom rushing through the crowd. Not because he wasn't famous, because no one expected to see Elvis Presley running alone on his wedding night. A waiting Cadillac stood beneath the hotel lights. The driver recognized him immediately. "Mr. Presley? I need you to take me somewhere." The driver smiled. "Of course, sir. It's urgent." The smile disappeared. Within seconds, the car pulled away from the hotel. Las Vegas slowly faded behind them. Neither man spoke. The only sound came from the steady ticking of the silver pocket watch resting in Elvis's hand. Tick, tick, tick. Every second reminded him of the promise he had made years before beneath the rain. A promise he had almost allowed fame to bury forever. The address led them to an abandoned neighborhood. Most of the buildings were empty. Broken windows reflected the moonlight. Old street lamps flickered weakly. The silence felt unnatural. Elvis stepped out of the car. "I'll wait here," the driver said. Elvis nodded. He followed a narrow alley until he reached a small wooden house that looked forgotten by time. One dim light burned behind a curtain. He knocked once. No answer. Twice. Still nothing. As he reached for the door, it slowly opened. Standing inside was an elderly woman. Her silver hair was tied neatly behind her head. She looked at Elvis with tired but gentle eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then she smiled. "I wondered how long it would take." Elvis frowned. "You know who I am?" She gave a quiet laugh. "Daniel always said you'd come." His heart skipped a beat. "You knew Daniel?" She nodded. "I raised him." Tears immediately filled Elvis's eyes. He's alive?" The woman lowered her head. "No." The answer struck him like thunder. "He died many years ago." Elvis closed his eyes. The hope he had carried for the last hour disappeared. "But before he died," she continued softly, "he asked someone to find you when the time was right." She invited Elvis inside. The small house contained almost nothing. A wooden table, 2 old chairs, a bookshelf, a fireplace. On the mantel stood a framed photograph of Daniel, older than Elvis remembered, smiling, at peace.
The elderly woman carefully opened a small wooden box. Inside rested a sealed letter. Across the front, written in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting, were 4 simple words. For my brother, Elvis. His hands trembled as he opened it. The paper had yellowed with age. The ink had faded. But every word remained clear. Dear Elvis, if you are reading this, it means I never found my way back. Please don't blame yourself. You kept your promise longer than you realize.
There was never a daughter. There was never a hidden fortune. There was only one thing I wanted to protect. Your heart. When I disappeared, I knew you would spend years carrying guilt that never belonged to you. So I asked that someone wait until the happiest day of your life, not to punish you, not to remind you of pain, but to free you from it. You once promised never to forget me. You never did. Now I have one final request. Go back to your wife. Love her completely. Don't waste another day looking over your shoulder. Some promises are meant to be carried. Others are meant to be released. This one, you may finally let go. Thank you for being my brother. Daniel. Elvis read the final line again and again. His vision blurred. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry. Not the tears of a celebrity, not the tears of a performer standing beneath stage lights. The tears of an ordinary man mourning the friend he never stopped loving. The elderly woman quietly placed a hand on his shoulder. He never blamed you. Elvis whispered. I blamed myself enough for both of us. She smiled gently. Then leave that burden here. He looked at the silver pocket watch one final time. The constant ticking suddenly felt different. Not like a countdown. Like forgiveness. He placed the watch inside the wooden box beside Daniel's photograph. I think... His voice broke. It belongs with him. The elderly woman nodded. I think he'd agree. When Elvis returned to the hotel, the celebration had nearly stopped. Guests whispered among themselves. The orchestra had fallen silent. Photographers looked toward the entrance. Priscilla still stood exactly where he had left her. She hadn't changed out of her wedding dress. She hadn't left. She simply waited. The moment she saw him, she walked forward. Not running, not angry, just quietly walking toward the man she loved. When they finally stood face to face, neither spoke. Words suddenly felt too small. Priscilla noticed the tears in his eyes. Without asking a single question, she reached for his hand. He held it tightly. I'm sorry, he whispered. She gently shook her head. You came back. He nodded. I almost forgot who I wanted to become. She smiled through her own tears. And who is that? Elvis looked around the silent ballroom, at the photographers, at the guests, at the bright lights that had followed him for years. Then he looked back into her eyes. The world knows me as Elvis Presley. He paused. But from this day forward, I want to be remembered as a man who keeps his promises. Priscilla wrapped both hands around his. You already are. The orchestra slowly began playing again, not because someone asked them to, because the silence had finally ended. The guests applauded. No one understood why. They simply believed they had witnessed another beautiful moment between a bride and groom.
The cameras flashed once more. Click.
Click, click. Those photographs would travel around the world. Millions of people would frame them, hang them on walls, print them in magazines. Generations would look at those smiling faces and think they knew the story. They didn't. They saw a wedding. They saw a smile. They saw the king of rock and roll beside his beautiful bride. What they never saw was the old pocket watch, the forgotten letter, the tears shed in a quiet house on the edge of the city, the promise that was finally released, or the silent battle that had changed one man's heart forever. Because sometimes the happiest photograph ever taken hides the saddest chapter no camera was there to capture, and sometimes the greatest victory is not won on a stage before thousands of cheering voices. Sometimes it is won in silence, in forgiveness, and in finally finding the courage to come home.